So thank you to our panelists and to our here for our panel on languages of race and belonging, multi-ethnic and interethnic dynamics in 19th century Louisiana print culture. I think this is going to be a fantastic panel. We've got some great papers here, so I'm excited. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put those in the chat, and we will have time for those at the end of today's program. So I'm going to start by introducing our distinguished panelists here, and I'll go ahead and introduce everyone, and then we can just follow the order in the program, and we'll get to hear these great papers. So our first presenter today is going to be Dr. Erica Stevens, an instructor of English at Houston Community College. She has authored multiple book chapters and articles on 19th century Southern writers, including African-American writers Alice Dunbar Nelson and Charles Chestnut, and Cherokee writer John Rowland Ridge. Her paper today is Unstoppable Conjunction, or Racy and Novel Contiguity, Forms of the Creole and Antebellum Travel Writing and Fiction. Our second presenter will be Dr. Sarah Salter, Assistant Professor of English at Texas A&M Corpus Christi. She's working on a monograph called Their North Nostri Selves, Editorship, Ethnicity, and Region in the 19th Century United States, and I can't wait to read it when it's finished. She's also published numerous additional articles, book chapters, and translations. And her paper today is Ethnic Community, Military Sociality, and Multilingual Intimacies, a Louisiana Newspaper Network. And our final presenter will be Dr. Jessica Barbata Jackson. She's Assistant Professor of History at Colorado State University and the author of the book Dixie's Italians, Sicilians, Race, and Citizenship in the Jim Crow Gulf South. And it was published in 2020 with LSU Press. So congratulations to Dr. Jessica on that recent publication. She's also published articles in the Journal of the Louisiana Historical Association and in Southern Historian. Her paper today is Citizens Plead Necessity for White Supremacy and the Privileged Dago Clause, the Power of the Press and Racializing Sicilians in 1890 Louisiana. So again, thank you to everyone for being here, and I will turn it over to Dr. Stevens now.
Hello, thank you for that introduction. I would first like to say thank you to the Louisiana Historical Association for providing this space for us to share our research and to gather virtually. I'd also like to thank Dr. Tucker for joining us today as chair and respondent. As a literary scholar of 19th century New Orleans, I often ask how language patterns and forms interact with factual history or social reality. As such, I would like to start by reading Edouard Glissant's description of the South and his definition of creolization. Quote, "The South has a name, creolization, the unstoppable conjunction, despite misery, oppression, and lynching, the conjunction that opens up torrents of unpredictable results, like a tumultuous and boundless Mississippi." With the idea of unstoppable conjunction, Glissant defines creolization as a process, but also as a kind of grammar. Rather than reading to recover instances of interethnic fusion, hybridization, or merger, in my archive of travel writings and short fiction, I am interested in the ways writers employ what I see as a dominant form for regarding and writing about New Orleans, the form of contrast. Contrast describes a stable set of objects held in juxtaposition or close proximity with no overlap or interpenetration. I found that for many visitors to the city, contrast was a useful form for imagining national relations in the antebellum era. In travel writing about New Orleans, contrast often appears as the rhetorical figure of parataxis, which lacks clear grammatical conjunctions of coordination or subordination. With parataxis, relationships of logic, space, time, or cause and effect are left for the reader to interpret. A famous example is the start of A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. Using this particular form allowed Anglo observers of the complex New Orleans scene to create a mutually appreciated cultural myth of lamentable Americanization. This myth would distract from more urgent racially motivated power struggles throughout the 19th century. Robert C. Reinders has argued that by 1850, economic or political tensions between the Americans and the French Creoles were all but dissolved, and intermarriage between white elites was common. Even as early as 1835, one visitor, Joseph Holt Ingraham, commented on the seemingly trivial cultural division of the city. After Ingraham expresses surprise at some small evidence of continued rivalry between the Creoles and the Americans, his local guide explains that he is mistaken. In fact, the divided ballroom is the result of, quote, universal unanimity of feeling among the parties, end quote. All that separates them now is language, and this separation, the French guide suggests to Ingraham, is for the best. Quote, were they indiscriminately mingled, the result would be a confusion like that of Babel, instead of that regularity and cheerful harmony which now reign throughout the crowded hall. Ingraham's anecdote of the ballroom partakes of the fantasy of two white nations contrasting in an amusing, cooperative manner, not in a dangerously interethnic or interracial overlap. Yet another example of the contrast form occurs at a ball, described in Abraham Oakey Hall's A Manhattaner in New Orleans. Quote, the complexion of the rooms was decidedly French, and yet with a dash of American feature and manner just sufficient to suggest a contrast. Hall, who would go on to become mayor of New York City, published his observations in 1849 in New York's The Literary World. But the Daily Crescent of New Orleans also reprinted some excerpts with editorial comment. The Daily Crescent was at the time a pro-slavery paper, and the editor took umbrage at Hall's description of the dirty New Orleans streets. The short blurb accompanying that excerpt notes that, quote, if we can believe newspaper accounts, the Bowery is not remarkably free from impurities, and Broadway itself feels the benefit of free soil. The jab at the soiled streets is, of course, evidence of the North and South divide over slavery. However, the playfulness of the pun on free soil and the reprinting of Hall's observations on New Orleans shows a kind of mutual recognition in the act of assessing one another's major US cities. I'll continue to offer just a couple more examples of this form of parataxis and contrast in writing about New Orleans. Another comes from Frances Trollope, a very famous travel writer who visited the city in 1827. She also explicitly mentions amusement, which tends to arise from this particular form of viewing. Quote, the large proportion of Blacks seen in the streets, all labor being performed by them. The grace and beauty of the elegant quadroons, the occasional groups of wild and savage looking Indians, the unwanted aspect of the vegetation, the huge and turbid river with its low and slimy shore, all help to afford the species of amusement which proceeds from looking at what we never saw before, end quote. Her list slides from people to environment, making neither the background for the other, but all part of a series of proximate objects or people without hierarchy, but still in some exciting indeterminate relation to one another. Celebrity writer and editor Nathaniel Parker Willis, who visited New Orleans in 1852, found the St. Louis Hotel's barroom to be the perfect representation of English culture with its cold julep cocktails. But from his hotel, he walks across the street to a French cafe and emphasizes his excitement over the contrasting watering holes. Quote, To have such marked exponents of the two countries as a barroom and a cafe on opposite sides of a street, each the best of its kind and each in full national operation and noisy exclusively with its own language, seemed to me a racy and novel contiguity. Writers like Nathaniel Parker Willis are hardly reliable historians, and like many visitors to New Orleans, Willis admits to following other travel guides as sources for his knowledge. However, the way these writers stage the proximate groups or objects show how and why the idea of ethnic contest between the Americans and the Creoles survived, despite shared economic opportunities and political cooperation. Contrast helped to create a specifically American grammar, one of apposition or of paracolonial relation. So the literary form of contrast I'm describing might be compared to Walter Johnson's idea of the steamboat sublime or the racial commercial sublime, which names the familiar descriptions of 19th century New Orleans levee scenes. Johnson argues that the rapturous writing about steamboats on the Mississippi River was part of a strategy to overwrite imperialism and dispossession. Superabundant lists and catalogs reflected the sublime. Contrast and parataxis, though, I want to argue, produce not feelings of sublimity, but feelings of mere amusement. Again, Willis's account of his travels offers an explicit example of how contrast works together with amusement. Willis determines what is uniquely beneficial in tropical travel. While touring the West Indies before he reached New Orleans, he writes in one of his published letters, quote, "The entire novelty of climate and vegetation and the close neighborhood of so many varieties of government and manners, Danish, Spanish, French, English, and African islands, all within a summer day succession of visits, amount to a delightful self-forgetfulness. Travelers are amused out of themselves and return to find that the body has taken advantage of the mind's absence to put the nerves to their proper work." In Willis's formulation, it is not simply the varieties of government and manners that offer healing amusement, but their close neighborhood. While the cultural clash between English speakers and French Creoles was a key theme of 19th century writings, many local writers composed patriotic works that emphasized a unique, locally based attachment to American-style freedom. The failed rebellion of 1768 by Creoles against Spanish occupation became a popular topic for antebellum Louisiana literature. Not because of antagonism against Americanization or nostalgia for French rule, but because these writers wanted to contribute their own sense of nationalism through local spirit and history. The topic was celebrated in a few different works. One was the 1836 English language play, The Martyr Patriots for Louisiana in 1769. In this play, a young French Creole fears Spanish tyranny and renounces loyalty to France. Quote, "Frenchmen will now disown us, Spaniards we can never be, nor Englishmen. But shall we be without a name? Of what nation will ye call yourselves? Old Europe has not a name to fit ye. Then let our country be Louisiana. Let's be Americans." These lines envision a strange possibility of an independent and yet American Louisiana, much like the fantasies of mutually enjoyable difference in the contrast form. However, there was very little English language literary output from Louisiana in the early 19th century. Most fiction or poetry by Louisiana writers was published in French. French language poetry in New Orleans and French newspapers, especially between 1840 and 1850, expressed the contradictions, fruitful or frustrating, of multiple national attachments. These writers knew they were, as Clint Bruce puts it, caught between continents. I find that a good number of these writers also employed contrast, but often quite differently than Anglo-American writers, and thus they use genre and form to contest how best to represent difference in New Orleans and Louisiana. The author I will discuss briefly in the rest of this presentation reveals in one of his short stories how the cooperation of multiple white ethnicities had come to support racist violence in his temporary home of Louisiana. In 1856, Louis Armand Garreau published Bras Coupés, the story of a rebellious Louisiana Maroon, based on the historical events of an enslaved man's murder in 1837. Garreau was himself an anti-slavery writer who shuttled between Louisiana and France, criticized in both locations for his radical beliefs. Garreau's story was published originally in a French literary newspaper, but I am completely indebted to Sarah Jessica Johnson, who recently published her translation of Garreau's story. The historical tale of Bras Coupés is well known for also appearing in George Washington Cable's 1880 novel, The Grandest Seams. To understand what's unique about Garreau's version of Bras Coupés, one needs to place it in the context of a genre that includes the various pantomimes, plays, and stories about other rebellious Maroons, such as Jamaica's Three-Fingered Jack and Haiti's Francois Mackandal. Including Bras Coupés, all of these real men originally found renown in newspaper accounts, in reports of a vengeful escaped slave who either terrorized travelers in the Jamaican or Haitian mountains or in the swamps of Louisiana. Louisiana's Bras Coupés, which means severed arm, has dismemberment in common with these other legendary Maroon figures. William Pietz has explained that the very idea of the fetish emerged in discourse at the same time stories about Haiti's Mackandal, whose arm was severed in a sugar mill accident, began to circulate in French and English in the mid-18th century. The fetish, Pietz argues, acquired meaning out of, quote, the abrupt encounter of radically heterogeneous worlds, end quote. It is not a surprise that the form of contrast, perhaps also defined as the abrupt encounter of the radically heterogeneous, found such frequent use in describing Creole and colonial relations. I have mentioned how contrast as a form elicited amusement, but in my reading of Garreau's story, suggests that his version of Bras Coupés purposefully excises the strain of amusement or celebration so often found curiously in many of these stories. Across most Bras Coupés, Three-Fingered Jack, and Mackandal retellings, the men are emphasized as possessing superhuman strength, fueled either by voodoo or obeah religious practices. In many of those versions, the singular Maroon is betrayed and sold out for a reward. In some, the enslaved hero returns to dance the Kalinda and to reclaim his wife. The Kalinda was a dance performed at Congo Square in New Orleans, but was also, according to some, the downfall of Haiti's Mackandal, who emerged from his hiding to dance and was thus captured. Stories of these legendary Maroons circulated as both anti-slavery arguments and as entertaining pantomimes meant to show outlawry dramatically expelled from plantation slavery. Most stories of Three-Fingered Jack end with celebration that order has been restored, or in some later versions, eliciting the audience's gratitude that slavery in the colonies had been abolished. For example, the end of Act 1 of Obi, or Three-Fingered Jack, a Serio pantomime, describes a quote unquote Negro ball where enslavers and the enslaved alike celebrate the elimination of terror from their plantation once Three-Fingered Jack has been killed. However, in his story of Bras Coupés, Garreau uses the characters of an Irish grocer, a French Creole planter, and a Spanish hunter to reveal how the complexities of empire work together at the expense of the enslaved and Maroon communities just outside New Orleans. Garreau's version begins with an image of the Bayou St. John, which connects New Orleans and Lake Pontchartrain. We learn that there on the bayou is a small shop owned by an Irishman named Hinckley, who sells contraband to enslaved people from the neighboring plantations. Elsie, a pregnant enslaved woman, steals food one day from Hinckley's shop. When Elsie's husband, Jim, tries to pay back what he can to Hinckley, Hinckley refuses the down payment and reports the theft to Elsie's enslaver, Monsieur D. When Elsie is punished and killed, Jim disappears. And even after being captured once and having his arm shot off, escapes yet again to the swamp and becomes known as Bras Coupé. When a reward of $6,000 is posted for Bras Coupé's capture, a Spaniard seeks out Jim, with whom he had been trading ammo for pelts deep in the swamplands. The Spanish trader kills Jim, but when he goes to the governor for his reward, he receives only $600. The story then ends this way, completely devoid of celebration. Quote, "As soon as word spread of Bras Coupé's death, Monsieur D returned to his plantation, but he was no more humane than before to his unhappy slaves." With its disappointing reward and unhappy slaves at the end, Garreau's contribution to the literary tradition of Marronage offers a specific Louisiana perspective back to France and to the sites of colonial slavery. I've discussed a particular pattern of contrast in travel writings and Garreau's implicit critique of it through his story of Bras Coupé. I have attempted to stage a collision between form and genre, between the outsider view and the view of a not quite native, not quite Creole perspective. I hope that this kind of work and attention to literature might continue to reveal conversations about difference across racial, ethnic, and linguistic lines. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stevens. Dr. Salter?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks to my wonderful fellow panelists, and thanks to Anne for responding and chairing this panel. And of course, I really appreciate being welcomed into the fold of the Louisiana Historical Association. So I'm really glad to be here. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. I have a little PowerPoint. Let me press the magic button. Okay. As you can see, the title of my paper is Ethnic Community, Military Socialities, and Multilingual Intimacies, a Louisiana Newspaper Network, 1853 to 1868. I begin this paper with a set of deeply uncontroversial claims. Newspapers help to create and sustain local communities in which they circulate. And newspapers, by virtue of circulation, can also help connect readers to a discursive community that exceeds local geography. Okay, but it's about to get a lot more interesting, so just hold on. These truisms have guided cultural historical work with newspaper communities for decades. Yet knowing that newspapers operate in this way through the creation of what Benedict Anderson famously called imagined communities does not begin to exhaust the complexity and frankly strangeness of historical newspaper communities and their networks. This paper is the beginning of my exploration of an elaborate editorial network of French political exiles as a case study for how newspapers can shift, shape, and reflect political and social commitments within their networks and communities over time. This paper begins to assemble and to reimagine a radical editorial collective that transferred from France to the Louisiana countryside following the revolutions of 1848 in Europe. These newspapers record the shifting of editorial politics away from radical republicanism in France to brutalist Confederacy in the United States. My hope is that this intertwined case study will offer some insights about the intersections of cosmopolitan and rural and their political implications in 19th century Louisiana. Beginning in the early 1850s, a collective of French political exiles, many of whom had worked as journalists and newspaper editors in France, passed several bilingual newspapers back and forth across the eastern portion of Louisiana and lower from New Orleans to the Texas border. And I'm only going to talk about two today, but you can see already in the two I have listed, we're talking about at least 6 people participating in editorial networks, each of whom had their fingers in other newspapers. The network begins with editor Hippolyte Prudin de Botte, who founded La Mescachebe, 1853 to 1857, after writing for La Revue Louisianaise. As editor of Les Mescachebe, he wrote under the pseudonym Prudin de l'Horte. In 1857, he sold La Mescachebe to Ernest Legendre and Eugene Dumais. Legendre split from Dumais to publish the Natchitoches Union and died in 1862, whereupon the Natchitoches Union fell to Louis Dupuis, who christened his new old venture the Natchitoches Times at the height of the Civil War. Although New Orleans was an initial landing base and a political touchstone for several of these editors, their papers spilled out into larger Louisiana spaces in smaller Louisiana towns. La Mescachebe was published in Lucy, Louisiana, and the Natchitoches papers, naturally enough, were from Natchitoches. Although I won't spend my whole time detailing the complex web of publications and editorial contributors, I will beg your indulgence for a few more details to illustrate the scope of the founding papers and their original editors before I pivot to talking about the multilingual values and assumptions that I find in the newspaper. La Mescachebe is the longest running and original node in the network. After its debut in 1853, it ran for 90 years with various interruptions and recalibrations in multiple rural locations in Louisiana. Likewise, the editor of the original Mescachebe went on to found or purchase numerous rural newspapers in Louisiana. So he outlived the paper he founded, right? And the paper he founded outlived him. The Natchitoches Times, once the Union, later became the semi-weekly Natchitoches Times, whereupon an American woman, Mary Edwards Bryan, came on as a co-editor before she left Louisiana to write and edit fiction in Atlanta and eventually in that bastion of Yankee liberalism, New York City. I rehearse all these connections and spreading editorial overlaps for two methodological reasons. First, I presume that such historical detail is welcome at a gathering of historians, especially one with an interest in the diversity and complexity of statewide history in Louisiana. As we know intimately or in broad strokes, Louisiana has a history of multinational, multilingual organization and management that stretches far back before it was part of the United States at all. In that context, the trajectory from French male revolutionary exile to female literary editor in New York City is a reminder of how the state has been both recognized and sometimes undervalued as a hub of internationalism and exchange, right? Beyond the scope of New Orleans, I think the state itself has a really complicated history of multilingual multinationalism. Secondly, I bring forward this network to counter an historical tendency toward editorial erasure or invisibility. As a figure of creativity and convention, the newspaper editor is most often visible in histories when he, and by far the most named editors in the 19th century United States are men, he is visible when he writes for a paper's pages. This is certainly the case for Hippolyte Prudin de Botte, who enters the historical record as a writer of multiple novels, plays, and editorials. La Mescachebe leaves no room for doubt about its politics and purposes, which are to translate business opportunities and enrichment possibilities for French readers of the parish of Saint Jean the Baptiste. Notices about movable goods for sale, descriptions of police meetings, and details about upcoming elections are all included in both French and English in early issues. So that's what you're looking at here on the left side of the screen, right? That's the front page. And as you can see, I've marked where there's both French and English, and the English translates from the French directly. But the more in-group materials, which are ironically tied to French politics and French aesthetics, are not translated from French, leaving only local French readers able to participate in the editorial exchanges and conversations represented in things like correspondence or reprinted fiction. Thus, while listings of human property and updates about public works were available for bilingual reading, the paper created and maintained a kind of political intimacy amongst presumptive French exiles. For example, an early 1854 issue prints a long letter from a correspondent who signs as citizen of the United States, in French, right? In which the writer describes the main issues on the European agenda as, quote, the Turkish-Russian war and the civil religious war of the bishops. As for the Republic, we don't talk about it anymore, he says, they say. Presumably, and given the article's mention of Napoleon III, this is a reference to the Second French Republic established after the 1848 February Revolution and increasingly understood as conservative and reactionary. The tendency to distinguish French internal politics from US considerations continues across the issues of Hippolyte Prudent-Debos's tenure, as the paper establishes itself at an intersection of bilingual local business and monolingual exile politics. The importance and influence of editorship asserts itself as the paper changes hands from the original editor to the collaboration of Legendre and Dumais. Gently but implacably, the new editors of Le Mescachabé reorient their publication. And so here on the left side is the new vision of the editorial collective, and on the right side is an older edition, right, from 1854. And you can see they look actually different. Fiction and poetry in French with no translation dominates all the sections of the front page now that are not advertisements. Bilingual business and political news still run on the second page, but it seems clear that the initial identity of the paper, to the degree that that identity is represented on the front page, has become more philosophical and aestheticized. By this time, in 1858, the paper is also communicating occasionally in Louisiana Creole, a dialect based in French but specific to the mixed communities of Louisiana. Thus, even as the paper is continually edited by French men from France, it becomes increasingly fractured in its commitments. Legendre split from La Mescachabé and from Dumais to found the Natchitoches Union, and his new paper inverts the design that had become common in the old one. English content makes up the entirety of the front page of the Natchitoches Union, and philosophical essays and correspondence collected under a French title flag inside the second page continue in French. So here you can see the English paper on the left side and the French paper on the right side, which is actually the second page of the English paper, but it has its own little, this is its own little title flag, right? It's announcing itself as the French one. As with La Mescachabé's developing French and Louisiana Creole readership, the Natchitoches Union declines to translate directly from English to French and vice versa, essentially creating two papers in one. A sample of headlines from 1862 might serve to illustrate the paper's identity and perspective. By the time the paper had passed to the fourth French exile in our network, General Butler's proclamation uses the Union occupation of New Orleans to introduce editorial grandiosity, which affirms the paper's bravery in speaking as an organ of the Confederacy. In English, the editor proclaims, quote, "No one ought to publish a newspaper who does not feel within himself," there's that editorial man voice again, right? Who does not feel within himself the spirit of independence and moral courage to publish what the public at large has a deep interest in knowing. Later articles in this issue include titles like Vigilance, Unmeaning Threats, and, quote, Our First Sunday Under United States Domination. And it's here that I want to turn from an accounting of these papers to a brief discussion of the political and historical implications I'm only beginning to tease out of them. First, I recall to you and me, I get a little lost in the archival editorial network. I'll recall to us all that the editors of these papers at this time are former French nationals. Moreover, according to the historical record representing these papers or accompanying them, all are exiles from the popular revolutions in France, which reshaped French politics and governance along lines of class, education, and geography. And so these are the kinds of places where I'm really excited to hear what Dr. Tucker has to say, because I know this is an area in which he is much more informed than I. So their relationship to an established political and nationalist entity like the United States or even we could say like the Confederacy, might be dictated more by local commitments and values than by a nationalist ideology. Moreover, we can see even from the brief excerpts I've shared that the performative nature of the paper's English Confederate identity is deeply invested in and inflected by grievance and self-congratulation. We might recognize that tendency of white supremacist editorship and circulation a little too clearly in our own moment. But it's worth pointing out here that this scene of heroic intervention into fractious politics for the benefit of a public at large is being posited by exile editors working in a bilingual rural newspaper. In fact, there's some real tension across the French and English iterations of the paper's Confederate attachments. In the French version of the May 22nd, 1862 edition, for example, the editor describes a committee of concerned citizens established in response to the Union Army occupation of New Orleans, with whom the editor has had a conversation. We agreed that this publication was harmful, but the public may not always be fair anymore. This is how we write history, the editor affirms. This is how we write history, provided that we satisfy our little grudges or passions, all is said. Given that General Butler, the Union Army general, was busy limiting and censoring French language publications in New Orleans, the disjunction between English aggression and French acquiescence may have been in response to perceptions about the danger of radical Confederate assertions in the French language. Indeed, the Union had introduced the matter of what it called foreign political participation months before in its pages, right, the Natchitoches Union, suggesting the need for greater legislative, that is to say, institutional clarity. The paper wrote, quote, "The duties and obligations of the militia in relation to foreign residents of Louisiana has never been defined in a clear and precise manner, and contradictions and conflicts appear every day. We cannot know the duties of each foreigner towards the Confederate government and Louisiana until the legislature shall have passed a law which can be understood as well by the governor and attorney general as by the humblest of our citizens." How all of these complicated, multilingual, multi-relational, political pieces come together is, on some level, the goal of this work in the long term. For now, all I can do is sort of pull some of these conversations from the pages of the newspaper and put them near each other and start to think about how they might overlap or diverge. Across linked publications and hardening political alliances, I'm suggesting that the intimacy and common cause of militaristic Southern nationalism became these papers' governing values. In fostering potent multilingual intimacies amongst French-speaking businessmen and military aspirants, these newspapers seem to have traded universalizing ideals of general will and common good for the exploitative defense of chattel slavery and the assertion of fundamental human difference. Ultimately, I want to use these papers to explore an international paradox of moral relativism through the militaristic imagination of two bilingual wartime Southern newspapers. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you to the LHA for hosting this collaboration, and to Dr. Tucker and to my co-panelists. I am honored to share a screen with you today. So I will move historically a little further into the 19th century and pick up in the 1890s. And I'll share my screen with you in just a moment. So after 5 Sicilians were lynched in Tallulah, Louisiana in July of 1899, the Times-Democrat of New Orleans published an article in defense of the lynching, quote, "Citizens plead necessity for white supremacy." Just the year before, however, as Louisiana legislators disenfranchised Black voters through the implementation of a literacy and property requirement for voting, they also passed a provision subsequently dubbed the Privilege Dago Clause that specifically protected the foreign white vote and Italian voting rights. How could Sicilians and Italians be considered both foreign white voters, but also susceptible to lynching? How could Italians fall both outside white supremacy's understanding of whiteness and also within it? And ultimately, what does a close reading of these moments demonstrate about how Sicilian immigrants were imagined by others within the state's English language press? So I'll go ahead and share my screen with you now. So expanding on a thread from my recently published book, Dixie's Italians, Sicilians, Race and Citizenship in the Jim Crow Gulf South, this paper reveals how Louisiana's English language presses, employing the power and language of race, shaped and informed how an immigrant community could be read, both figuratively and literally, exposing the fluidity of Italian racialization, often an after effect of violence and disenfranchisement efforts rather than its cause. And this paper ultimately shows how the language of race could be used to manipulate who had access to citizenship and belonging in 1890s Louisiana. So first, a note on race. Now, critical whiteness scholars have provided a much needed discourse to understand the intermediary racial status of arriving European immigrants at the end of the 19th century. Yet the multifaceted racial structure of Louisiana requires a more nuanced and fluid, more fluctuating and more shifting concept of Italians' racial status than scholars have previously adopted. So I provide a new framework for understanding this liminal racial status of Sicilians and other Italians in the US South, what I call racial transiency. This transiency, which highlights the instability of their racialization, meant that Sicilians and other Italians passed among and between racial communities. They moved and were moved as both white Southerners and people of color back and forth across the color line. For this reason, Italians were lynched in defense of white supremacy. And this map over here on the side is showing, demarcates those lynchings across Louisiana and Mississippi. So Italians could be lynched, but also possess, quote, unconquerable white blood. Italians were depicted as contributors and proper citizens before the infamous 1891 New Orleans lynching. But then in defense of their bloodshed, they were, quote, a menacing gang of murderers and degenerate monsters. When they marched in the streets to protest disenfranchisement in the 1890s, they were ignorant and brutal and a, quote, disgrace to a civilized community, but still granted voting rights as faithful allies, good citizens, and foreign whites. So turning to 1890s Louisiana, the 1891 lynching of 11 Italians in New Orleans was not the only lynching of Sicilians and other Italians in the Gulf South during the late 19th and early 20th century. In fact, there were more than 24 Sicilians and other Italians who were lynched in the region between 1886 and 1910. So I move now to 1899 Madison Parish, where trouble began over a goat. So the popular and vivacious DeFatta brothers owned 2 grocery stores in Tallulah. Because of their financial success, certain members of the community regarded them with secret animosity, but otherwise they often caroused with prominent community members, drinking and playing cards. Wednesday, the 19th of July began like any other day. In the humid midday heat, a goat belonging to Francesco DeFatta wandered onto the property of Dr. J. Ford Hodge. It was not the first occasion that DeFatta's goats had trespassed on Hodge's estate, but having grown impatient from the repeated intrusion onto his balcony, on this particular sweltering day, Hodge drew his revolver and shot the interloping goat. The following day, Francesco, aggrieved for his goat, called to Hodge across his property. They quarreled, exchanging a barrage of animated words, but with no serious consequences. Less willing to dismiss the incident so easily, when DeFatta's brother Carlo encountered Hodge later that day, Carlo spoke harshly with Hodge. As the conversation grew increasingly heated, Carlo struck the doctor with his fist. Although Carlo was otherwise unarmed, Hodge drew and fired his revolver, grazing Carlo on the forehead. As Carlo collapsed, Hodge placed his boot on his chest, holding him to the ground. Giuseppe, the third DeFatta brother, witnessed the fray from the gallery of their home. While Hodge worked to clear the chamber of his jammed revolver, boot still lodged on Carlo's chest, Giuseppe fired upon Hodge from the balcony with the pistol loaded with birdshot. Word spread swiftly through Madison Parish that, quote, the Italians had killed Dr. Hodge, and the 3 DeFatta brothers were hastily arrested. The sheriff rounded up Giovanni Cerami and Rosario Fiducia, 2 Sicilian friends supposedly in cahoots with the cold-blooded foreigners on charges of conspiracy. Within hours, hysteria over Hodge's shooting enveloped the parish. Disquieting murmurs and anxious broadcasts reported that in an act of premeditated homicide, Hodge had been shot 50 to 75 times. With the 5 Sicilians confined in the parish jail, a crowd, quote, intoxicated with blood, multiplied outside. After constructing makeshift gallows from a device used to hoist cattle for skinning, the throng stormed the jail. They first dragged out Carlo and Giuseppe, then Francesco and Rosario, and finally Giovanni, making 3 separate trips from the jail to the swine slaughterhouse. In 3 separate acts, the frenzied mob lynched 5 Sicilians to enact vengeance upon the guilty and to, quote, teach the Italian and his gang a lesson. Meanwhile, Dr. Hodge survived the shooting and was declared out of all danger 3 days later. Now, post-lynching press accounts employed an unequivocally racialized discourse, which affords the impression that Sicilians and other Italians were lynched because of the racial ambiguity. Though true that Sicilians and other Italians were at risk for being lynched because of their race and ethnicity, evidence of such prejudice and racialized stereotypes has obscured other instrumental factors. Italians were susceptible to lynching because they were Italian, but they were not lynched because they were Italian. Instead, their Italianness meant that they could be lynched, but the particularities of each lynching resulted from a continuity of causes and specific time and place contextual factors. And yet significantly, in the aftermath of the violence, community members and the English language press employed race to defend the killings in explicitly racial terms, even if race was only tangentially related to the conditions that instigated the killing. The press protested that, quote, the same punishment would have been vented upon any set of men, no matter whether they were Italians, Englishmen, Germans, or natives of the United States, but ultimately justified the lynching in racial terms. And although sort of some of the images I have here are not as crisp as Dr. Salter's, I figured that since we are analyzing newspaper discourse, I should demonstrate some of the sources I'm using here. The Times Democrat entitled their piece, quote, "Citizens plead necessity for white supremacy," and defended the lynching on the grounds that it was necessary for white supremacy. The native-born white community in Tallulah felt obliged to commit the lynching, since the complicity in the conspiracy could never have been proved legally, and that to ensure white supremacy, no other course was possible than the course pursued. Now, suggesting that white supremacy would otherwise be in jeopardy indicated that Italians could be, when necessary, consigned outside a larger category of whiteness. Relegating Italians to a position outside of whiteness presented a popular means to validate the lynching and to ensure the legitimacy of violence that would otherwise undermine white and nativist respectability. Ultimately, this process of racializing Italians was an after effect of the violence rather than its cause. Italians weren't necessarily lynched because of a racial animosity, but race was used to justify the lynching violence. Specifically, the language of race was used to validate violence. So I will turn now to a second example, the 1896 and 1898 disenfranchisement debates in Louisiana, to show how the manipulation of racial language played out in terms of the discourse of voting. In 1896, Louisiana Democrats proposed a suffrage amendment carefully and explicitly calculated to disenfranchise the state's Black population, as well as, quote, illiterate voters, foreigners, and immigrants, and a specifically major category of contention in Louisiana, quote, declarant aliens, non-citizen immigrants who had made it known their intention to naturalize. During these debates, Italian immigrants publicly and candidly joined the fray in proclaiming their opposition to disenfranchisement. In March of 1896, 2,000 Italians held a mass meeting conducted entirely in Italian in Old Fellows Hall on Camp Street in New Orleans. After a host of speeches, which encouraged participants to vote the Democratic Party line and commit to helping, quote, the party which helps the Italians, the meeting adjourned, though their demonstrating continued as the gathering moved into the streets and culminated in a festive parade. And the map here shows the route of the parade through New Orleans' French Quarter. Subsequently dubbed the Dago Parade, at least 50 Italians on heavy draft horses made their way through the streets of New Orleans. The quote, thundering of the hooves on the pavement sounded like the march of 2 or 3 regiments of cavalry. Marchers promiscuously shot off fireworks and carried lanterns, sticks, and banners, one of which even had a live rooster perched upon it. They carried additional roosters in bird cages and perched on staffs, while at least a dozen goats accompanied the procession, some of them being led along and others carried in a wagon and allowed to feed on flowers. Parading beneath an Italian flag, participants carried banners which read in English, quote, "Down with the suffrage amendment. We are Democrats and not grasshoppers. We demand that the mechanic, the clerk, and the laborer, white and black, have the same privilege to cast his ballot on election day as the millionaire." New Orleans newspapers did not report favorably on the Italian meeting, as you might have imagined, and the Dago parade. Estimating that, quote, 1/2 of them did not know what they were there for, the Picayune characterized the participants at the meeting as too enthusiastic. Noting the use of profane language, the press described the events as an uncivilized display of rowdyism and a disgraceful spectacle. The amassed were, quote, the sorriest looking set of citizens that anybody would care to rest their eyes on, and a disgrace to a civilized community. Despite certain protestations to the contrary, the employment of ethnic stereotypes explicitly noted the foreignness of the meeting. The Picayune explained that the act of parading beneath the Italian flag offered evidence to support amending the state's suffrage and naturalization laws. Quote, "How long do you suppose they remain here if they manage to accumulate a few dollars? Why, they will go back to Italy and there live in comparative luxury for the rest of their days." Emphasizing the fact that no English was spoken notably marked the meeting as dangerous and uncivilized, since only someone with, quote, some knowledge of the English language could raise above the level of a 4-footed animal. In contrast to rhetoric from the 1870s and 1880s, supporters of disenfranchisement in 1890s Louisiana invoked the long-standing Northern stereotypes and perception of the Italian immigrant as a temporary sojourner, a bird of passage, as fodder for suffrage constraints. Local politician Captain William Dufour, capitalizing on existing xenophobic tropes, asserted that participants at the meeting were, quote, ignorant, brutal, and alien, and did not even know or understand why they were called together for speech and for parade. Just as anti-Italian discourse emerged locally in the post-lynching era to justify the violence, the disenfranchisement debate similarly adopted anti-Italian language common in the national press to delegitimize the Italian meeting and substantiate voter restriction. The ballot reform debates were temporarily put on hold until the state's constitutional convention in 1898, where the suffrage amendment proposed an educational qualification or literacy test. However, for those unable to meet the educational qualification, the proposal included a series of additional entitlements for the franchise, including eligibility based on property ownership. So expansive were the exemptions, the Times Democrat proclaimed that the, quote, monstrous suffrage plan had created a series of, quote, electoral freaks and monstrosities. Initially, the controversial Section 5 exemptions also included the following provision, quote, no male person of foreign birth who shall have been naturalized prior to the adoption of this Constitution shall ever be denied the right to register and vote in this state by reason of his failure to possess the educational or property qualifications. Louisiana's English language press subsequently dubbed the provision the Privileged Dago Clause. Meanwhile, the suffrage amendment and foreign voting rights in general became a source of statewide debate for weeks. Calling it an insult, an injustice, a scandal, the Times maintained that the provision was, quote, a glaring show of partiality in favor of the illiterate and naturalized voter as against the illiterate of native birth. The Monroe News suggested that the suffrage amendment was, quote, simply solely a petty-fogging trick intended to permit a lot of illiterates and riffraffs whose skin happens to be white to vote whether they know what a ballot is or not. By censuring the Privileged Dago Clause for enfranchising a lot of ignorant Dagos and shutting out a great many whites, opponents challenged the very place of Italians within a white man's government. Grounded in an understanding that the Black vote was more easily controlled, such palpably racist language designated the foreign vote as considerably more dangerous and disregarded the legal whiteness of Italians. This explicit denial of Italian whiteness, wherein the racial questionability of Italians overshadowed their skin that, quote, happened to be white, like the very act of lynching, collapsed Italians' race and color and constructed Dagos in opposition to or outside whiteness. Convention legislators eventually passed a suffrage amendment, which included a residency requirement, a literacy provision, a property requirement, and a poll tax. Despite the at times hostile anti-Italian remarks during the 1890s debate, and a certain sentiment that cautioned against trusting, quote, white foreigners to vote, the Louisiana Convention did pass the Privileged Dago Clause. The preservation of Italian voting functioned as a product of certain legislators recognizing Italians as useful constituents and voters. Regardless of opinions that problematize the racial position of Italians remain enfranchised, collapsing their race and color in the name of home rule. These disenfranchisement debates reveal that Italians in Louisiana were available pawns within local politicking. Those who contested the Privileged Dago Clause, specifically Reform Democrats, articulated their opposition in terms of rightful citizenship, loyalty, xenophobia, and racial questionability, all of which garnered publicly consumable support to eliminate the political machine. Others who favored the Privileged Dago Clause, specifically the regular Democrats, did so because of the professed political functionality of Italians. The efficacy of Italians compelled regulars to protect the Italian voting bloc and their constituent base. Italians retained their right to vote in Louisiana not because of their racial acceptability or elevated status, but because of their value in serving the regular democratic machine. Ultimately, while not resulting in their systematized or institutionalized Jim Crow segregation, Louisiana's social convention, legal practice, and print discourse variously denied Sicilians and other Italians access to informal citizenship. Employing Natalia Molina's concept of racial scripts, which speaks to the discursive continuity of racial projects across time and space, exposes how Louisianians both advanced and denied Italians the privileges of citizenship by employing or countering the same racial scripts used to marginalize Black Southerners. Similarly, transnational anti-Italian and anti-Southern Italian dialogue and Northern anti-Italian nativism also operated as racial scripts, which communities in Louisiana weaponized in various times and places to justify violence against and validate the subordinate status of Sicilians and other Italians. Focusing on scripts of citizenship incorporates the political and economic factors that underwrote contestations over Sicilian and Italian citizenship identities, while the context of Louisiana print culture highlights the duality that Sicilians and other Italians were both privileged as white Italians and marginalized in violently real and racially discursive ways as racially suspect Dagos. In this way, because of their racial mobility and transiency, and through their efforts in navigating the Louisiana racial structure, Italian immigrants and the circulating language of race in turn contributed to the codification of Jim Crow. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters for those excellent papers. Just so interesting and so much good stuff to dig into there. So I've got some comments for our panelists, and then I'll open it up for Q&A. We've already got a couple of questions. That's great. Keep them coming in the chat box. So Dr. Stevens kicked us off using the idea of contrast to understand how visitors to and residents of antebellum New Orleans understood Creole cultures, as well as African-American, maroon, and enslaved cultures, and how these cultures helped define and relate to American nationalism. Stevens's subjects used print culture to ultimately reinforce as well as question white American nationalism, while the travelers described the conjunction of French and American cultures in Louisiana as amusing, reinforcing the American nature of the city. New Orleans residents, particularly African American, focused instead on the contrast between free and enslaved cultures, highlighting a key problem with and limit to that American nationalism. As you continue your research and analysis, I'm interested in learning more about the interactions between these two aspects of New Orleans print culture. So, do the travelers write about Maroons and African American culture? Do the Creoles write about their own Creole nature? Are they observers of their own Creole identity? Do any of these writers combine these analyses? And what can we as scholars learn by combining these analyses? So I can't wait to learn even more about this fascinating idea of contrast and identity in antebellum New Orleans. Dr. Salter carried us forward with another discussion actually about contrast. Her subjects also inherit a contrast, this time between the French Revolutionary heritage that led them to their exile in Louisiana and their new Americanness, which quickly becomes a Confederateness instead. These exiled French newspapermen use print culture initially to reinforce their French identity by drawing clear lines between French language articles designed for the French community versus English language articles designed for the general English speaking community. Upon the outbreak of the Civil War, however, these newspapermen changed strategies, now using their print culture to emphasize their commitment to the new Confederate nation. And of course, in doing this, these French exiles who are using their status as newspapermen to shape their identity and their relation within the South, they're part of a long tradition of exiled revolutionaries who went on to edit and publish and write in newspapers in exile here in the United States. So, of course, John Mitchell, the Irish nationalist, Carl Schurz, the German 48er, the rest of the robust German American newspaper industry. So we have that context to help us understand these French exiles. And these French exiles are also part of a robust French language press in Louisiana that, of course, already existed when they arrived in the wake of 1848. So we have these two different kind of nodes that we can use to help us understand these newspapermen. And that kind of leads to what I'd like to know more about with this research. With these French Revolutionary exiles, how much did they utilize or draw on or refer to that revolutionary heritage? Did they explicitly call on their French values or on their revolutionary experience? Certainly Mitchell did, and the German 48ers did. Is this something that carried over into these French exiled newspapermen as well? And in particular, I'm interested, perhaps selfishly because this is my research, do they draw comparisons between their revolutionary heritage and the Confederacy in particular? Again, Mitchell certainly did draw comparisons between Ireland and the Confederacy. So I'd love to know if these French newspapermen did as well. And if not, is this an aberration? And if so, why? If the French kind of uniquely do not draw on their revolutionary heritage, what's going on there? So that's something I'd love to know more about in the future. And finally, Dr. Jackson concluded us today with an analysis of Italian immigrants in Jim Crow, Louisiana, who once again are also the subject of a contrast. This time, a racial contrast where they're coded white for purposes of voting and non-white for purposes of lynching, tragically. And building on this racial transiency, as she calls it, Jackson thus uses print culture to understand how newspapers shaped not just ethnicity, but the race of Sicilian immigrants in late 19th century Louisiana. And I'd love to know more about that concluding statement you just told us, that print culture's treatment of Italians reinforcing Jim Crow. Did the Louisiana newspapers treat violence against African Americans differently than violence against Italians? Did they draw contrasts between Italians and African Americans, or did they compare them in order to intensify prejudice against one group or the other? So did they kind of play these groups off of each other, juxtapose them in their analysis in any way? And so yeah, I think that's a very interesting idea about how these Italians and the analysis of them help shape Jim Crow. So to put these together, we have 3 papers exploring how print culture in Louisiana shaped ideas of culture, race, and nationalism in Louisiana, with its particular blend of heritage, immigration, and American statehood. And these papers reveal, of course, 19th century Louisiana to be a very diverse place with ever-changing ethnic makeups, as well as ever-changing national loyalties from French to American to Confederate and back to American. And although these papers focus on very different subjects, they all deal with similar themes of contrast, and particularly how their historical subjects used that contrast to define and delineate ethnic, cultural, national, and racial groups. Ultimately, in each paper, the producers of print culture seek to use their writing to define who is and is not American, who counts as part of the American nation. And indeed, in defining who was and was not American, these examples of print culture also reinforced their writers' commitment to the idea of American as white, native-born, English-speaking people. And they even use this print culture to paint non-white, non-English speaking, non-native-born peoples as threats to Americanness and American identity. So by defining these groups as threats and as outside the bounds of Americanness, or having to redefine them as amusing in the case of French Creoles in order to kind of incorporate them into this category of Americanness, or define them as politically useful in the case of Italians and voting. So basically, either they're useful, amusing, or outside the bounds of America and threatening. And what this print culture does through these contrasts and this analysis then is ultimately seek to limit the power of all of these groups, whether it's amusing French Creoles, Italians who may or may not be useful or white, depending on the context. Certainly Maroons defined as outside the American nation, French exiles who themselves decide to commit themselves to not being American by committing to the Confederacy. All of this print culture, again, seeks to define who is American, limit the threat and power of groups who are un-American, and ultimately, in doing so, all of this print culture reinforces the racist, nativist power structure of the 19th century United States. So these papers suggest many fruitful avenues for future research. They emphasize the importance of print culture and helping us understand the process of making and shaping these categories of identity and belonging, both people shaping their own desired identity, as with the French exiles, as well as people who are having that identity imposed on them from the outside. So that's something that I think is an important methodological approach that certainly will continue to yield helpful results. These papers also reveal 19th century Louisiana to be a place where identity, culture, and even nationalism were in flux, and where various groups therefore sought to take advantage of this fluidity in order to define the situation to their advantage. So like I said, I really enjoyed these papers and appreciated the opportunity to read them. So do any of our panelists have any comments they'd like to make, or do we want to dive into the Q&A? We've got about 15 minutes left, and we've got some questions in the queue already.
I'll just echo Sarah in the chat. That summary and comment was brilliant, the way you tied those together. And I understand my own paper better now that you've given that comment. Thank you so much.
Well, that's always the best when somebody else can kind of really nail it there. And obviously, I thought your idea of contrast was brilliant and really just was the theme that helped tie all of these papers together.
And it's useful to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to jump on and reiterate what Sarah and Erica said, and also just thinking about how exciting it is that this is recorded, because I can go back and I was trying to take notes on what Anne was saying, and I was then realizing that, oh, it's recorded, because that was a really brilliant comment. So thank you. Sorry, Erica.
Thank you for your, again, wonderful paper. So. Okay, so the first question that popped up, many thanks for the excellent paper by Erica, which prompts two questions. Does your research suggest a context or political purpose for literature of the 1768 revolt? And two, did you uncover any body of literature regarding the arrival of the Acadians? And if so, what were the contexts or political purposes?
Thank you very much for those questions. The first one about the rebellion of 1768, actually the author of the Bras Coupé story, Garreau, Louis Armand Garreau, he has his novel, Louisiana, published in French, which I have yet to really delve into, is also about that event. And he actually revises the end of it so that it is a successful rebellion. So when I continue to write, I mean, the fact that he's revised the Bras Coupé story in these very subtle ways, but then revises the historical narrative of 1768 in such a major way, is something I definitely want to look more into, and probably does, as the question posed suggests, like have a lot of opportunities for further exploration and political purpose, varying political purposes probably. The second question, no, I woefully have not encountered much on the arrival of the Acadians and how they would figure into this model of contrast. And really that model comes from trying to figure out why a lot of these writers, they're not quite writing always about New Orleans or Louisiana's exception to the rest of the nation, which is, I think, a model that many of us are familiar with. But one of difference, but also of something that is cooperative through that contrast. So I'd be interested to see how yet another group fits into that. But unfortunately, no, I don't really have an answer to that. Thank you.
Lots of groups in Louisiana. So the next question is for Sarah. Can you estimate the percentages of French and English speakers in Natchitoches Parish in the 1860s?
So this is a great question. Thank you for it. It's like, this kind of question is the reason why, for me, history events are so important, right? Because I'm sort of like, there's people speak French, you know. So I will freely confess that I don't have a hard and fast answer, but I can make some sort of guesses related to the historical records piece that I know, particularly around newspapers. So I'll lead by saying, like, my guess by the 1860s is it's fairly small, somewhere below the French-speaking population in Natchitoches, somewhere below 15% of the residents, maybe into the 20s. And I'm saying that for a couple of reasons. The first is by the 1820s, French speakers are no longer a majority population in Louisiana writ large or in New Orleans. And this is in part, I think, and I imagine there's people in this room who know more about this than I, in part one of the reasons why Louisiana or French Creole becomes a sort of dominant dialect, right? Because there's a kind of mixing language. I see Anne maybe has a thought about that.
I was turning up my volume. Continue.
So there's that piece. There's a sort of movement from like standard French to Louisiana Creole or Louisiana French. The other thing is that in the 1860s, as I'm sure folks in this room know too, the teaching of French in schools had been way repressed, in part because General Butler outlawed it, right, in New Orleans, at least in the city proper. And then the last thing I'll say, which is actually a sort of show and tell, is, and I don't know if folks have seen this ever, but the Chronicling America Library of Congress database, which is where I pulled those images from, also has a digitized map of different language community newspapers as they are represented in the Chronicling America database. So if you'll indulge me for 1 second, I want to show you this image here. So this here is, the green spots are all of the French language newspapers in Louisiana that Chronicling America has at all, right, over, as you can see, like 300 years. And this up here is Natchitoches. Right, and so what I presume from this digital representation, which is not exhaustive of all newspapers, but Cronam has a pretty robust set of Louisiana French newspapers, is that the sort of population of real French speakers who were passing that language on in a standardized way in their families was sort of vanishingly small the farther west and the farther north that you got in the state. So that's maybe my long way of saying, I too would like to learn more about that. Thank you for that question.
Okay, we've got another question for Sarah. Did your research uncover any consolidation toward a single concept of being French over time, considering the several subgroups, i.e. the Royalists, the Republicans, the Saint-Domingue exiles, the Acadians, and the foreign French? And that's fabulous. And I want to know more about that as well.
Yeah, thank you for that question too. I was actually thinking while Erica was talking that there's an old history dissertation that I want to send you that's sort of about Acadian, like the Acadian influx into Louisiana. And I'm not sure. I can actually say, in fact, my research more often is like Jessica's about Italians in Louisiana. And so what I know about that really firmly is that like Italians who understood themselves in regional terms in Italy came both for reasons internal and external to understand themselves more as Italians in the United States than as like Sicilians, right? Or Florentinians or whatever sort of regional identity those individuals would have had. So I'm not sure. What I would say initially is that I think that my guess is that French language speakers in Louisiana did not consolidate in the same way because of the racialized politics that were involved so assertively, right? Which is to say the other French language newspaper I work on in Louisiana is a radical abolitionist newspaper published by Black men from the United States and from the Caribbean. And those men are also using French, but they are using French basically to make the opposite argument of the newspapers I've been talking about this entire time. And so I think because the racialized politics of French in Louisiana were so hierarchized and so contentious and had such high stakes, my working assumption is that that consolidation didn't happen in the same way for French speakers that it happened for Italian speakers in the state. Does that seem right to you, Jessica?
My very anecdotal data there is that the Saint-Domingue refugees certainly married into the white French Creole populations. And, you know, again, anecdotally, in one family, the Lacoste family, my middle name is Lacoste, my grandma's grandma still spoke only French. And they very much claimed a French Creole identity. But that's not very scholarly. I don't see any other questions in the chat yet, so keep them coming. I have a question for Jessica in the meantime. Like I said, I was really interested in this conjunction of the Italians and Jim Crow. And when you're giving your paper just now, I was kind of thinking about kind of this change over time that you kind of touched on with changing identity of Italians over time. And so I was wondering, here in the 1890s, you're really looking at this moment where Jim Crow is being formalized and solidified. So how did that advent of the formal system of Jim Crow impact Italians and views of Italians?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that to me is part of what's so fascinating about this story, because we have the multi-layer that Sarah was just talking about with regards to, I talk throughout my book about the fact that these are Sicilians and other Italians, because by and large, these 90% of the Italians in New Orleans are actually Sicilian, as opposed to 25% at the national level. And in addition to Sicilians, we're talking about Southern Italians, which have a very complicated relationship with the state at this point. They are emigrating en masse because they've been disenfranchised from the Italian state. So they don't speak Italian. We have the language piece again, and Sarah and I have talked about how the Italian language press is there's like 4 crumbling issues that, in New Orleans. So one of our gaps here is that we don't have the Italian language press to really sort of do a deep dive, but I sort of track the benevolent associations to see how these communities are interacting. And there's these specific Sicilian benevolent societies, because they're not allowed in the Italian benevolent societies. So that's being layered on top of the fact that already Italians are in this sort of complicated racial place, the in-between language. And then this idea that Louisiana is so fascinating because of this, multilingual, multi-ethnic, multinational history that is sort of attempting to defy Jim Crow for, maybe long, chronologically a bit longer. And so all of this is happening at the same time. And so I do see it, when you were talking about the usefulness and Italians being seen as they're almost a practical way to impose Jim Crow, that's sort of how their racial experience is being used to sort of codify and separate. And they're recruited to replace slave labor. So part of this is about, replacing and removing the former enslaved populations with this white laboring group. They very much are not, Italians themselves are not necessarily, they're not always participating, but in moments when their voting rights are being sort of attempted to be taken away, they are then working to perform as white Southerners. And so that to me is partially how they're participating in this codification, is that they are, representing themselves. And then we probably don't have time to go into this, but there's the whole indemnity issues. You were talking about the lynching situation, with how comparing and contrasting how this is different with how Black lynching victims are treated. And you have the Italian state that is actually stepping in, demanding that payments be made on behalf of the wrongful deaths of their subjects in a way that's very different from how Black lynching victims are treated. And then it becomes this whole, the press discourse is actually having conversations, trying to argue that Italians are citizens, even if they never took out naturalization papers, because that would mean that the US doesn't have to make indemnity payments. So there's sort of this very complicated, backstory about who is a citizen and who is not, and actually why those conversations are happening.
Very interesting. Thank you. Other questions from our audience here? Feel free to type them into the chat box. Do any of our panelists have any additional comments or thoughts they'd like to share?
I would just like to say that, Jessica, I just find your argument that that racialization was not the cause of the lynching, but happened after the fact is so important, and I think is such crucial work to differentiate those patterns of lynching from African American lynchings, and is so relevant to the conversations we have about how race and racism works today. So that was just mind-blowing to me.
Thank you, Erica. I mean, to me, it's really just about how powerful discourse is, and then how the discourse, and that was, I feel like I found that argument very late into this project, because I started thinking, oh, I'm going to look at, what caused the 1891 lynching, and expecting to find the racial language in the 1870s and 1880s, and it wasn't there. And so then part of it was about just revising this idea that it's not like a long-standing anti-Italian sentiment that explodes in this lynching. There's something very different going on. And then the fact that we're using these, the scripts did exist in the North, talking about Italians as parasites and scum, but adopting that language to then justify this violence that is very much more of a local story. And to me, it just ties in with an ongoing way that racial language is sort of coded in ways to justify violence into our present moment. And that to me ends up being this really important piece of why recovering these histories is really important in terms of understanding our current moment. So thank you.
Well, I think that's all we have for time. So thank you again to our wonderful panelists for these fascinating papers. Again, I think this was just a fantastic panel. And thank you so much to our audience here for being here and for those great questions as well. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your Wednesday night and spring.